Both cameras rolling. Mm.
All right. You tested your sound already, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
but for double checking, you can see those meters, but I'm pretty sure it's fine.
All right. So, tell us about your father.
First off, my name is Joseph Calvin Kennedy Jr. So I guess it starts there. I'm the second, uh, following a Joseph, but I always tell people that my name is J.K., Jody, Joe Cool, Brillo, Speedy. So all those represent different phases of being my dad's son. I don't know, where can I start? I guess I start with some early memories. Let's see. My first memory is a memory I don't really have because my dad was in Korea when I was born. I was 6 months. I was 6 months old before I saw my dad, and we went off to New York. That's stuff I heard about. Um, Let me think. I guess some of my early memories of being with my dad was he was working on his PhD at Columbia University, and he would have these little 3x5 cards, and he would be studying, and I guess he'd give some to me to help him study. So he was studying for a PhD, and so was I. Um, so I'd say I don't know. From there, uh, sure we went on off to West Africa, but we went off on the Queen Mary, and luckily, amazingly enough, there's footage of that. There's footage of me playing shuffleboard on the Queen Mary because my dad had a camera. So to this day, as we're taping, we're using cameras. But my dad had an 8 millimeter film camera, of which we posted some of that. The Queen Mary, a little bit in Liberia, London, and Paris.
Joe, what was he like? Well, let's start as a disciplinarian. Did he discipline you? Did you ever get whippings, or was it just enough for him to speak to you?
No, yeah, I'm gonna say no and then yes, but no whippings. That wasn't. We were we were more sophisticated than that. So
So
we
you
weren't.
didn't get
No,
switches.
I didn't get switches or whippings or. Um, no, Dad was always very thoughtful and kind, and I mean I don't know. I can hardly even remember if I had anything like that. That's probably why I was just trying to go through, you know, some of the stuff that I was thinking of. But he was firm, but mostly it was a good time.
I mean,
Um,
how did he? Because he's been a teacher in so
yes.
many capacities. How did he teach you?
How did he teach me? Well, I would say mostly by example. So whether he's studying for the PhD, whether he had the camera, then I ended up with the camera. Um, Traveling, then of course I ended up traveling. Uh, I guess always being encouraging. Whether I started to do my music, he would say, continue on with the music. Or when I started performing, he'd come to all the performances. When it came time to go to college, he knew about Antioch College and I didn't. So,
So he was always very supportive.
oh yes, always very supportive. Um, and I guess it's hard to judge oneself, but I wasn't. I was alternative and a free thinker and creative, but I wasn't really weird or Dad didn't really have to. Like I said, I mean, I was always pretty calm, and some people even thought I was shy at some point.
I never thought you were shy, and I've known you a long
I mean, people
time.
would, but people might see me sitting someplace and they go, "Well, he's sort of quiet," but then they say, "Oh, he's not really that quiet." But I wanted to jump back into some of those things. Once we ended up in Africa, sure, my first school was actually in Ghana, but then I also went to school there in Rome. So somehow all that worked out. But I do remember being in the little red Volkswagen, and we talked about the crocodile chief, and when I ran from the crocodile, and I was only 6 years old. But somehow there we were in Ghana, and luckily enough, there are pictures of all this um, when my dad talked about how they would hug me, and I was hugged in a village up in northern Ghana someplace. I said, "Oh, this is my child and my grandson." So those are some of my early memories of
Well,
tagging along with my dad, basically.
yes, and tagging along was all around the world. And I'm sure at that point you were too young to realize that you had a very special childhood, quite different than most people, especially most blacks. But now that you're older, have you reflected on the fact of how special that was?
I definitely know how unique it was. It's one thing to have memories, but it's another thing to also have the photographs in my dad's book, snapshots along the way, color in the cage. My mother, there I am coming off the plane in Africa. And then years later, I said, Dad, where is this footage? And so I actually took the 8mm film footage and put it on DVD.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way of, a lot of people had experiences, but they're just gone. So I think the fact that both my mother and my father, they documented this stuff, and that's a lot of what I do, whether it's with dance companies or other musicians. So I definitely learned that whatever talent you have, you got to write it down, you got to document it, you got to videotape it, you have to publish it. So.
All right, Joseph Calvin Kennedy Jr.
Mhm.
What are some of the things that he imparted into you?
Well, like I said, a sort of a gentleness, a creativity, being inquisitive. Um, but as my dad would say, none of this was necessarily planned. But I think when you go to 13 different schools, like um, you're always thrown into a new mix. Uh, so, and because Dad was always very personable, I always remember being at the airport or something place, and they say, "Oh, Mr. Kennedy or Dr. Kennedy, good to see you." And so I got from an early age that he was popular and he was well liked, and so I seemed to pick that up. I remember each were going, "You're the way, Dad. People are always running into me now, or I got that from you, and I guess you got that from your dad. People just want to talk to you or seem to be friendly." Um, so that's all. Having the books around, listening to opera on Sundays. Knowing a lot about jazz, not just hearing that same old Motown beat. That's sort of a joke, but turned out that old Motown beat is still going, and all that. But I think it was sort of like having a collage experience. We moved around, even though my parents separated. I don't remember being angry or bitter about that. Like I said, that's when Grandma appeared and took care of me, and then that one summer, Mrs. Kennedy dropped me off to Mrs. Hawkins. And then there I was over in Europe visiting my mother before I went to visit my dad. And I don't remember any of that being a problem. So somehow my dad was very supportive and encouraging, and I don't remember him really yelling at me. I don't know, maybe once or twice.
You talked about the fact that your father was very popular and very respected. Well, he's also a great man, and a great man on a worldwide playing field. So as you became a young man yourself,
Hmm.
having a great father, was that ever intimidating to you?
Okay, I'm going to say no because there were so many experiences. It wasn't because we were still always doing things, and we were always sort of moving on to something a little different. Uh, does that make sense? Or even with Africare, I did get to go on one trip. I was over there about 5 or 6 weeks. But so it was all very positive stuff, but it wasn't like I'm the king or I'm the president or I've sold 20 million copies. It was all somehow very organic. It was all very people oriented, community oriented, and that's sort of what I picked up. Like I do things in schools, or I'm at drum circles, or um, I think it was a community thing. You were working with real people,
Mm-hmm.
and by working with real people, it didn't go to your head. So when somebody say, "Well, my dad was in 100 countries, or I was in 26 countries," I just said, "Well, I was blessed."
All right, so now you have Joseph Calvin Kennedy III, correct?
That's right. Joseph Itra Calvin Kennedy III.
All right. So, from some of the things that your father imparted into you, do you see any of that going into what you're doing with Itra?
I can say something very specifically. When my parents did separate, my dad and I got on the train. I don't know whether that lasted 6 months or a year, but we got on the train from Washington to New York so that every weekend I could still see my brother and I guess my mother. And I don't know whether my dad went out to James and Janie's while I spent time with Adam and my mother. But so every weekend we were on that train. So that was solidarity, more of a political term. But fast forward to when Ichiro was 6 and 7 and all that, I became the central figure. I mean, there was Sue, the stepmother, there was Renia, the real mother, but Dad and Claire were down the street. But, there was a time when Ichiro could have been taken off or gone some other place. But I always, I think intuitively, instinctively remembered my dad had stuck around. He was there for me, and he made the effort to keep the family together. And so that's right. So I still get along with Renia and things like that. And, from the time I guess each was 7 or 8, that's why I walked him to the bus stop. And there was one beautiful year when I was the head coach, my dad was the assistant coach, and Ichiro was a player. And we actually, I have that picture. That was one year that all 3 generations would be at the games together. So I would say that's something major. So because I'm more of a spiritual person, as you know in early ages, I wasn't running out to be with you in Hollywood, or I just kept growing and evolving. But I think the family thing was very important. So I stuck around and did my cable TV show on Arlington Cable, did things like that, so I could stay close to my son. But I would say I got that from my dad, because intuitively, I remember my dad, we took us on that train every weekend until finally, I guess we moved to Washington, and then he went on to Africa. But